better than being in one corner, don't you think? So, and more approachable, perhaps. Thank you very much, Bishop Fitz, for your kind introduction. I have actually been able to make every one of these wonderful conferences that you have arranged, and it's a major achievement, and I'm sure it requires considerable hard work on your part and the other organizers to do this year on year, but we are so grateful that you have established this great tradition really in the middle of a crisis in the church. So thank you. Now, when I look at all of us assembled here, the question naturally occurs, why are we all here? Why is it that we are all here? There are people here who perhaps are descendants of slaves, and others who are certainly descendants of slave owners. There are people from different parts of the world with many different backgrounds and talents. I myself come from a Shia Muslim family background. And why am I standing here in front of you this morning? I mean, this is the question that we must keep asking ourselves. And the reason, of course, is that each one of us, and all of us together, have heard a story. We have heard the story that the apostles have told about how they have seen and heard and touched with their hands God's own truth, God's own word revealed in Jesus Christ. This is the burden, for example, of the first letter of St. John. And this apostolic teaching in a real way makes the church, makes us that family that we were hearing about at morning prayer, if you were there. Now, the point is that this story has to be told again and again. It's not just told once. When we hear it, when it becomes ours, it then has to be told again so that others can hear it, and that is how the work of the church goes on. But the whole of the story has to be told, not just bits and pieces that we like. The whole counsel of God has to be brought to bear on the issues and the situation that we face. The apostles had seen and heard and touched. They have told us the story about Jesus. But it is not just a story about Jesus, but a story that leads us to knowing Jesus. That also is very important, that the story is owned by us, it becomes ours as we seek to believe it and to live it. And as I say, it is the whole story. Now, although, of course, it is the church's responsibility to tell the whole story, to reveal the whole counsel of God, it is undoubtedly true that in certain situations, in particular circumstances, certain things about the story are noticed that haven't been noticed as well before, or the church may be reminded of certain things in the story. I'm told again and again by our African American brothers and sisters that it is the Exodus story and what I have called the Exodus trajectory in the Bible, that of God's purpose of liberation, that has been so celebrated by them. And in a way that is not a surprise. That is also true of other people who have experienced oppression or slavery or any kind of restriction of their freedom. This can also be true about how the church gives a place to particular groups of people in its life. The role of women in the home, in the church, in the community, all of this can be noticed in a fresh way by the church. And that is, of course, as it should be. So as the story is told and retold, there are certain aspects of the story that come to our attention in particular circumstances. That's what I'm trying to say. However, that is not all that there is about this apostolic teaching and its telling and hearing, because there is also what we might call the engagement with the new, with new knowledge, for example. And there are, of course, ecclesiastical traditions that don't want particularly to engage with new knowledge. And to some extent, I respect them. But Anglicanism has never been that. There has always been a desire to bring the apostolic teaching to bear on what is new, on new knowledge. And there is new knowledge. We were alerted last night, wonderfully well by Paul, about things that claim to be new knowledge and are not. So we have to be very careful about what we do accept as new knowledge. But I think we would have to say, would we not, that we live in a world of such rapid change that we have to accept that there is knowledge around that even our parents had very little access to. As some of you may know, I was for 6 years the chair of the Ethics and Law Committee of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority in the United Kingdom. And this is a very interesting example of what is new knowledge and what is claimed to be new knowledge. There certainly is new knowledge. I mean, we know now more about the early embryo than our parents did, and certainly much more than past ages have done. However, certain things are claimed about the nature of the embryo, what can or cannot be done with it, or should not be done with it, which is not knowledge but opinion, but is sometimes presented, as Paul was saying in another context last night, as knowledge, as science, but in fact is not. So how do we relate to new knowledge? How do we discover its authenticity? And how do we bring the gospel to bear on it? I think this is a question for us that we cannot evade. But of course, the thing about it is that it must be principled. It must be principled, this engagement with new knowledge. John Henry Newman, for example, talked about the conservation of the gospel, that we cannot relate to the new knowledge in such a way that compromises the very nature of the gospel that we are hearing about. There must be continuity of principles. So if, for instance, we have a particular view about the human person, that has to be engaged in how we deal with the early embryo, or indeed, at the other end of the spectrum, with the later stages of life. There has to be anticipation of the future, so that the future is seen in the light of the Christian story and not separated from it. I mean, these are all ways in which we can fruitfully engage with new knowledge. But as the story is told and retold in these different ways, in different contexts, in the light of particular problems, sometimes a question arises, is this part of the apostolic story at all? And of course, in a very major way, we have been faced with this question in our own life in the Anglican Communion in recent years. Is what certain churches that they are proposing to do, is it actually anything to do with the apostolic teaching? And when that question arises, how is it to be settled? Now, it is here that the Anglican tradition has always appealed to Scripture. Scripture is not something over and against or apart from the story that is being told and retold and lived in the church, but it is the norm by which we discover what is actually part of the story and what is not. This is why the Bible has been so important in the Anglican tradition. You study something that is important, not something that is not important. And that is why it is such a huge part of the liturgy. I mean, just at morning prayer, I was struck, were you not, at how much Bible there was in the worship. Of course, there are many different ways of reading the Bible, of studying the Bible, of praying the Bible. I don't want to tell you about that. You know as well as I do what happens. But there are some things to note about the study of the Bible which are relevant to what I'm trying to say. First of all, we must acknowledge, and Paul said last night he was not a biblical literalist, we must acknowledge that there is a great background to the Bible, how it came to be, the different parts of the Bible, the oral traditions behind them, the way in which the text itself has developed in a number of ways, has been edited and re-edited. In this way, the story of the Bible is quite different from the story of the Quran. I often say to my Muslim interlocutors, the Quran was completed more or less in the lifetime of a single man. Here you have a collection of books that have come into being in very complex ways, many different kinds of literature. You have history, you have poetry, you have romance, you have the prophets, and so on. This morning we were being told about the special nature of the book of Genesis, indeed. So the behind the text study of the Bible, in which Anglicans have played such an important part, remains crucial to the formation of those who are studying for the ministry, for preaching in the church, for the place of the Bible in the church. Behind the text, what lies behind what we see. But then, of course, it is also important for us to study the text itself, the language of it, the grammar, the syntax, and so on. And many people, quite rightly, give a lifetime to this. And we are enriched by their study of the text itself. I was a student in Cambridge when a German New Testament scholar, Ernst Bammel, used to teach. Do you remember Bammel? And he was a very precise textual scholar. And I remember on one occasion he was showing us a manuscript, I think it was of St. John's Gospel, and he said, you see this hole has a very long history. And then he went to tell us what the history of the hole in the text was. Well, thank God for Ernst Bammel. So there is behind the text, there is in the text, and then, of course, there is in front of the text. It's how the Bible is related to our particular circumstances, to our culture, and to our context. In this, I have been very much influenced by the work of Professor Lamin Sanneh, who was at GAFCON. Some of you may have heard him there. And Lamin has, his doctoral work was actually on the translation of the Bible into African languages, and his thesis was that the people, the missionaries mainly, who translated the Bible into a number of African languages, did not realize what they were letting loose, because the impact of the Bible has been quite revolutionary on many African cultures, sometimes for the good, and sometimes, of course, the Bible has also been misused in those cultures. Anyway, that was Lamin's thesis, but he has gone on to develop this idea of translation or translatability as of the very essence of the gospel. And he points out that the New Testament was written not in Aramaic, the language of Jesus, but in Greek. So you begin with translation. And again, in this matter, the Christian faith is quite different from Islam, because Islam is, as you know, a worldwide religion and is growing very rapidly in many parts of the world. But wherever you go, although there are local manifestations of it, there is a certain Arabicness about Islam that you cannot get beyond. The Quran has to be read in Arabic in the end, even though there may be translations of it. The ritual prayer, the salat, has to be said in Arabic. The call to prayer has to be in Arabic. They tried it in Turkish and after Ataturk, but it didn't work. Now, what Sane is saying, who of course is a convert from Islam himself, is that the Christian faith is different. It is intrinsically translatable. It is, in fact, the gospel is translation. It's God's speech made human. Now, Pope Benedict also, in his Regensburg lecture that attracted publicity for other reasons, I don't want to go into those for the time being, but really the lecture was about the relationship of gospel to culture. And the point that he was making was that the gospel had a particular providential relationship with what he called purified Hellenism. That it was the encounter of the gospel with Hellenism that gave the church the vocabulary to evangelize the Hellenistic world. And although he puts a lot of weight on Act 16 and the invitation from Macedonia, personally, I don't think Act 16 can bear the weight that His Holiness puts on it. Nevertheless, I think we can agree with him that the encounter of the gospel with Hellenism was indeed providential. The question which he does not address is whether there were other encounters happening at the same time or around about the same time that were equally providential. And the question that he does address is, what about providential encounters today? Such providential encounters today. How is the gospel encountering civilizations, philosophies, ideas, worldviews, with that kind of transformative experience and impact? Now, all sorts of examples can be given from history, good and bad, about such encounters, but it may be worth remarking at this time that Anglicanism has always held to a particular view about this encounter with culture. To worship in a tongue understood by the people, for instance. That the traditions of the church do not have to be the same everywhere. The preface to the Book of Common Prayer goes on and on about how it is important to render the liturgy of the church in a way that is friendly to the culture of the people who are worshiping. And I think it is not an exaggeration to say that the translation of the Bible into English by Tyndale and others was significant not only in an ecclesial sense, but it was actually the beginning of the creation of the English language as we know it. It is very difficult to imagine a Shakespeare or a Milton or a Donne without Tyndale and Coverdale and the King James Version and so forth standing behind them. And similar things can be said about the Book of Common Prayer and the liturgical tradition of the church. So there is this affirmation of the need to engage with culture and language that is to be found in Anglicanism, and we should welcome this. This is part of the missionary calling of the church among particular peoples and cultures. But what is a strength can also become a weakness. And whilst the strength is this openness to culture, the weakness, as Philip Turner and Ephraim Radner have rightly pointed out in their book, The Fate of Communion, the weakness is a tendency to capitulate to culture. And I think they have established that this is a danger that Anglicanism has faced from the very beginning. And so the kinds of capitulation that we are seeing around us today are also of a piece with something that is inherent in the tradition, but which we are noticing today for particular reasons. So when we talk about the in front of the text encounter, the Bible coming into contact with culture, of course we can say many positive things, but what else can we say? Are there any limits to the process of inculturation? There are different ways of speaking about this. You can speak about inculturation as a process in which the mind of Christ or the mind of the Scriptures is so rendered into the life and the language of a particular people that it can inspire them, that it can provide the authority for them to live in a godly way, and all sorts of things can be said positively. But negatively also, I think something needs to be said. And I think what may be worth just saying at this time, see how you respond to this, is that it seems to me that there are two limits to the process of inculturation. One is the nature of the good news of Jesus Christ itself. Nothing can be done or said in this process which, for example, obscures God's communication of His word, of His mind, of His purpose to human beings. Nothing can be said about the way in which God provides the means for the making of peace between humanity and God. Nothing can be said that obscures the nature of the resurrection and its implications not only for us, but for the whole world, for the renewal of creation. That's the first limit, that the process of inculturation should not obscure what is fundamental about the good news. The second is that it should not make fellowship difficult between you and me, between churches and Christians in different cultural contexts. So your expression in your culture of the gospel cannot be such that I fail to recognize it when I come here. And of course also the other way around. Now, this has always been a way of maintaining Catholic unity in the church. The exchange of certificates, of baptism, of communion, the recognition by bishops of one another as true bishops in the Catholic Church, communion among the churches and so on. But of course we now live in a situation where cultures are in closer contact with one another than has ever been the case in history. And so we have to be even more alert to this question than past ages have been, not less, more alert, more aware of how to maintain the fellowship. Now, I said at the beginning that the church is made in a real sense by the telling of the apostolic story, and that is true. But I think we need also to ask, by what else is the church made? And I think we would have to say that it is also made by the ministries that God has provided for His church. Both Michael Ramsey in his book, The Gospel and the Catholic Church, and John Webster from the evangelical Anglican point of view in a very important article, speak of what may be called the self-organizing power of the gospel. Now, that is certainly true in terms of the individual living the Christian life, but they apply it also to the way in which the church is formed. This is not to say that we have to sacralize every form of church government and every vestry meeting or whatever, certainly not. But we do have to ask how the ministries provided by the church have to do with the gospel itself. That they are not just an accidental, as it were, development in the life of Christian communities. And the preface to the ordinal, attached to the prayer book, as you know, sets out clearly the relationship of the ministries that God has provided for His church with the gospel itself, with the apostolic teaching itself. And so, particularly in the ministries of deacon, priest or presbyter and bishop, we have something that exhibits, if you like, this self-organizing power of the gospel. This is not just a godly order that we have adopted. I mean, it can be that, but it's not only that. There is more to it than that. It shows forth the nature of the good news itself and how God wants it lived and spread in the world. I say this because this understanding of the Christian ministry is in jeopardy in the Anglican Communion and in relation to the Anglican Communion. It is in many ways very good that the Vatican has produced the proposals for the ordinariate for Anglicans who want to come into communion with the Bishop of Rome. And there are many good points about the proposal. For instance, for the first time, the Roman Catholic Church officially in its documents accepts that there is such a thing as an Anglican patrimony that must be preserved. So it's not absolutely null and utterly void after all. So that's to be welcomed. However, what has surprised me most is that in accommodating Anglicans, the Vatican has produced a Presbyterian order. In the ordinariate, there are no bishops. The ordinary may be a presbyter. I mean, that is actually the word that is used in the Apostolic Constitution. This is very strange because I've been a member of ARCIC for a very long time, as many of you know, and I thought that we had agreed with the Roman Catholic Church about the nature of the Christian ministry. An agreement certainly that our representative bodies like the Lambeth Conference have said that these agreements are consonant with the faith and practice as Anglicans have received it of the apostolic teaching. And then you find the proposal which has no bishops in it from the Roman Catholic Church. Very, very strange. I mean, look, just remember the fuss that was made about the Church of South India proposing to have a few presbyters who had not been episcopally ordained, just on a temporary basis. But now we've got this amazing anomaly that is being proposed. So the church is made by the apostolic teaching. The church is made by the ministry that God has provided for it. The church is also made by the sacraments. I mean, one of the dangers that we have to avoid is turning Anglicanism into a kind of preaching tabernacle, because the sacraments are also a real means of grace, and not just a memorial, not just a symbol, not just an ordinance that we must continue to repeat, not knowing what it means, but a way in which we are strengthened spiritually, feed on the benefits that Christ has won for us, and be able to live the Christian life. Now, having said that, the different ways in which the church is made, and turning to our own ecclesial family issues, what is it that the church needs so that the apostolic story can continue to be told and retold and heard again? What are the things that we need? I think we need effective ways of gathering. From the very beginning, people with agenda have opposed effective Anglican gathering. So when the first Lambeth Conference was convened, some people did not want to come to it. Well, some English bishops didn't want to come to it because they thought it would compromise the royal supremacy. And when it was convened, it was only convened on the basis that it would be purely consultative. And what difficulties that word has caused us over the generations. How we can gather in a way that is effective in terms of teaching our people, of learning ourselves, and of spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. Secondly, the gathering, at least in some cases and some of the times, has to be about common decision making. You cannot have a church where decisions cannot be made by people coming together. I was very interested in the text of the covenant in its description of the Lambeth Conference, which says all sorts of very interesting things about Lambeth conferences, but one thing it does not say is that the Lambeth Conference can teach. And yet, manifestly, one of its greatest values, whether in terms of the articulation of the quadrilateral, the appeal to all Christian people, the teaching on family life, on church unity, has been when the Lambeth Conference, as a conference of bishops, has actually taught the communion, and perhaps wider than that, something important about the Christian faith. But that's missing in the description of it in the covenant. And as you know, I was notable by my absence at the last Lambeth Conference, but those people who were there also felt, on the whole, and there are several present here, that there was no way in which the bishops together could teach the faith of the apostles. Well, this is ludicrous. I mean, to spend millions of dollars on a gathering of bishops where the bishops can't teach the faith of the apostles. Amazing, isn't it? So the gathering has to be effective, there must be common decision-making, and then there must be discipline in the church. At the time of the Reformation, there was considerable debate about whether discipline was something that was inherently part of the church. And I can see why that debate happened, given the excesses of the medieval church in ecclesiastical discipline. But having said that, I think the Anglican conclusion to this debate was that discipline was necessary for the being of the church, not just for its health, but for the church to be the church. I mean, the second book of Homilies is quite clear about that, and I think most of it was written by Bishop Jewell, and I certainly think of him as someone who established what Anglican character was. So discipline is necessary for the life of the church, and discipline should not be taken just negatively. There are positive aspects about the church, about its life together, that have to do with discipline, and not only of the church, but how the church relates to society, to the world outside, which also have to do with the church's view about the human condition and what sort of disciplines lead to human flourishing. Again, there are people who deny that the apostolic teaching has anything to do with such discipline. This is not something that we can accept. The whole counsel of God, the whole story being told, is not only to do with believing, it's not only to do with faith and trust in God. Of course, it has to do with all of those things, but it also has to do with living the Christian life day by day. When Benedict went under another name, you remember, he had another name, he pointed out actually in a very important article on the creeds that when we think of the Nicene symbol, for instance, or indeed the Apostles' Creed, which we said this morning, it is not just what the church believed that produced the creeds, but how that church lived. And this is why in Anglicanism, the first councils of the church are regarded as particularly authoritative, because it's not simply what the church said in the creeds, but how the church lived its life. That is important. Now, in this gathering, decision-making, and discipline, different ecclesial traditions have emphasized different things, and I wonder whether some kind of synthesis might now be possible as a further step in ecumenism. So, the Roman Catholic Church, notoriously or famously, depending on your point of view, has exercised the importance of the teaching office for the health of the church, for its continuing vitality. And I have to admit that as an Anglican, I feel sometimes envious about this. I mean, if only we had such an effective teaching office, we might not be in the mess that we are in. Of course I do. But then I realized that the teaching office on its own is a very dangerous thing. There have been numerous occasions in the past when the teaching office has not been faithful to the deposit of faith, for all sorts of reasons that we needn't go into now. Anglicans, classically anyway, have emphasized the importance of the deposit of faith, with the scriptures, of course, as normative in that deposit. But they have not had an effective teaching office. So the question arises how you bring about the application of the norms of faith into Christian living. And the challenge, I think, ecumenically for us must be to bring these two things together. The deposit of faith and an effective teaching office must both together make for a healthy and vibrant church. Talking about the deposit of faith, I think we must say, must we not, that it is important for Anglicans to agree that they are a confessing church. I am deliberately avoiding the use of the word confessional because you can have a debate about that. I mean, certainly Anglicanism does not have the great confessions of the Reformation period, and we may be thankful for it or we may regret that. But confessing the faith, to confess with your lips, to believe in your heart, I mean, that must be fundamental to the Christian life as well as to the church, mustn't it? Many people think that Anglicans can believe anything. And some people think that Anglicans believe nothing. Well, I don't know which is worse. So if there is going to be principled engagement with one another, let alone with the world outside and our ecumenical partners, we must say that there is something that we are willing to confess. Creedally, scripturally, morally, different ways. Then, secondly, and this goes back to the effective gathering, we must be properly conciliar. Now, I know that Kevin, I don't know if Kevin is here yet or not, but I know he's been going on and on and on about that. But there is a truth here that the councils of the Anglican Communion have not really been conciliar in the way that they should. They've not been allowed, I think, to be conciliar in that way. And yet, we cannot carry on like that. The final draft of the Anglican Covenant poses some very interesting questions in this regard. I'll come to that in a moment. So, confessing, conciliar, consistorial, that is to say, while we do not want to recreate Presbyterian consistories in the way that they existed, there must be some way in which councils can make effective decisions, and not simply recommendations. And this is one of my big problems, as I was just saying, with the final draft of the covenant. You have a good theological introduction. You have a good preamble and the first sections. And then it is as if the mountain gave birth and a ridiculous mouse was born. Because what you have is a standing committee. I mean, I'm not sure of the ecclesial standing of a standing committee, making recommendations to provinces and the instruments of the communion, which recommendations they may or may not accept. Well, what kind of common decision-making is that, and will it stick? I mean, it may actually make the schism worse. Because I can guarantee you that any recommendation of any sort that a standing committee might make, some provinces will not accept, and maybe some instruments will not accept of the communion. What actually is the ecclesiology of this final draft? It starts with a wonderful description of the church drawn from the Anglican Orthodox agreement, the Church of the Triune God. But in fact, as it works out its ecclesiology, it is not that of the Church of the Triune God at all. It is back to a reassertion of the old primacy of autonomy, which is the basic problem in the first place. We can begin with interdependence and come to autonomy. But if you begin with the kind of autonomy described in the draft, you will never come to true interdependence. I mean, that is the lesson that we have to learn. Now, I want to finish, of course, that whatever else we say, we must remain focused on the mission of the church. One of the things that has made me so tired, and no doubt you as well, is this constant ecclesiastical wrangling. Rather than reaching out to people, making new Christians, supporting Christians under pressure, as we speak, there are Christians being tortured in prison for their faith. And I can give you numerous stories from different parts of the world about that. So we must guard ourselves against over-institutionalizing. And this is why I think that Anglicans have to be reminded of the importance of movements in the church. Archbishop Bob, just as I was having a word with him, said he wanted to speak to me later about Soma. Well, I hope I haven't offended Soma in any way, but Soma is a very good example of a movement in the church for renewal. The Church Missionary Society, of which I was the General Secretary for 5 or 6 years, when it was first formed as a voluntary movement in the church, it wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury asking for permission to be an Anglican society. And it took 2 years for the Archbishop to reply. Well, that didn't stop God's work. That does not and should not stop God's work as God brings his people together. We don't have to wait around for the institution to say yes for us to fulfill the missionary mandate of the church. The monastic movement, again, Pope Benedict, in his Regensburg lecture, which of course was addressed to European academics, noted what important developments in the Christian church had taken place in Europe. And he said, except for some in the East. Well, one development that did take place in the East was monasticism, of course, which was brought to the West by Athanasius when he came here as an exile because of his firm stand for orthodoxy. But monasticism actually was and should remain a movement in the church, not an institution, but a movement for the renewal of the church. And we too, I think, are being challenged about this. Many of us have confessed before God and others that we fail to see the strategic importance of EMEA when it was first established. We failed to see that the emphasis was on mission. But now I think it is important for us to recover this sense of a missionary body or missionary bodies flourishing in the church for the sake of holding it in orthodoxy and renewing it in faith, preparing it for mission in the world. The Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans in Britain is also at this time working on the possibility of producing such a model, a missionary model, which certainly protects those who are orthodox in faith from the sort of oppression that you are only too familiar with. But it's not just about precious ecclesiasticalism. It is actually to equip people to make new Christians, to plant churches, to make sure that that apostolic story it is possible for us to tell and retell. So thank you very much indeed for your patience. I think I've said enough, Bishop Fitz, for the time being anyway, and I look forward to people's response. Thank you.